Hi everyone, and welcome to part one of our macromolecules lessons. I usually do this as one long lesson in class, but I figured this week I'd break things up a little bit just to, I don't know, hopefully make things a bit easier, a bit more manageable. So it's going to be a bit of a combination. Each of these videos is going to be a combo of me explaining things as well as videos that I've found that just do a good job of kind of giving a picture, putting a picture to what I'm trying to explain, and they go into details a little bit deeper. So grab the note that I posted on Google Classroom that goes with it, or write your own, whatever you prefer, and we'll get started. Okay, so first of all, what are we made of? We are made of three things mostly: water, macromolecules, and micromolecules. And micromolecules are those vitamins and minerals that are still super important, that are still vital for survival, but we're not really going to focus on them for now. We may touch on them next week, but for today, we're going to focus on macromolecules. So what are macromolecules? Macromolecules are large organic molecules made of mostly carbon atoms. And there's four main types. There's carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acid, or DNA. So these three are bolded. Those are the ones we're going to focus on, and that's actually going to be how we break up the videos this week. So today we're going to talk about carbohydrates. The next video will be lipids, and then the third one will be on proteins. We're not going to talk as much about nucleic acid just because it's less of a thing when we're talking about nutrition and what we get from our food. These are the main three that play a role in nutrition. So let's start with carbohydrates. There's my hilarious cartoon. Okay. So carbohydrates are molecules that contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they're mostly used as a source of energy. They are produced by plants during photosynthesis, and they're broken down by animals through cellular respiration, which creates ATP. So if you've taken bio this semester or last semester, then that should hopefully ring a bell, cellular respiration. But if not, basically you just need to know that that is the process that happens in our cells to create energy. And this ATP is like an energy molecule. So we're using carbohydrates to be able to create energy in our cells. There's three types that we're going to talk about: monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. You may have heard of these before. You may have, if you read nutrition labels ever, you may have seen them, but we'll break down what each of those means. So the first one is monosaccharides. And so if we break that, it's kind of a big scary bio word. So if we break that apart, mono means one, and saccharide means sugar. So this is a one-ring sugar. And we can see that in the picture. I know these pictures kind of look complicated as well, but it's basically just one ring of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And so monosaccharides are the simplest type of sugar molecule that we have. They often have a sweet taste. That's the typical formula, chemical formula for monosaccharides. And some examples would be glucose, fructose, and galactose. So again, you may have heard of those, may have seen them on nutrition labels. Those are our main monosaccharides. Disaccharides. So if you look at the picture here that we pointed out before on monosaccharides, one ring. And now we can see in each of these pictures we have two of those rings. So, and that's exactly what the name means. Di means two, and saccharide, as we said, means sugar. So this is two sugar rings together. So a combination of monosaccharides. And depending on the combo, we get different types of disaccharides. So glucose and fructose, if we attach those, we get sucrose, which is table sugar. If we combine two glucose molecules, we get maltose. If we combine glucose and galactose, we get lactose, which we may have heard about if you know people who are lactose intolerant. That's that molecule there. polysaccharides. Poly means many, and saccharide means, as we said, sugar. So many sugars together. And if we look at the picture, we can see we've got a whole bunch of rings attached. So this is a long chain. And so they're a little bit more complex than our monosaccharides and disaccharides, and they need to be broken down before they can be absorbed. So we can't just absorb something like this into our bloodstream. We have to break it apart first, and that's part of the digestive system process. So some examples of polysaccharides. The first is starch, which is how plants like to store their carbohydrates. They store it as starch. There's cellulose, which is used in plant structure. So cellulose is found in the cell walls of plant cells and help it to hold its rigid shape. We've got glycogen, which is how animals, including us, store our carbohydrates. We like to store it as a glycogen molecule, so we kind of create this long chain, which makes it easier to store. And then something called chitin, which can be used in different animals for structure. So things like insects have exoskeletons. They don't have interior skeletons, they have exoskeletons, and that's often made of chitin. There's a few others. There's cephalopods have beaks that are made of chitin and things like that. So they can be used for animal structure as well. Okay, so this is the part where we'll switch over. We're gonna watch a super quick video about how we digest carbs. And now if you haven't watched the digestive system refresher lesson from last week, you will wanna do that first, because we're gonna start to get into some detail about exactly how our digestive system breaks these macromolecules apart and uses them. So if you need to refresh again, then feel free to pause and go do that, but we're going to move on and just keep going with that.
Carbohydrates are nutrients that provide your body with energy. But before carbohydrates can fuel your morning run, they must be broken down into their basic units called monosaccharides and absorbed out of your digestive tract and into your bloodstream. In this lesson, you will learn about the enzymes that break down carbohydrates and how this important nutrient is absorbed. Now, we previously learned that digestion of carbohydrates, and in particular starches, begins in the mouth with the action of salivary amylase. This enzyme catalyzes or speeds along the hydrolysis of the starch molecule. You may recall that hydrolysis is how nutrients that you eat are broken down, and it involves splitting bonds with water. Now, even though carbohydrate digestion begins in your mouth, very few of us chew our food long enough for salivary amylase to have a significant effect on the carbohydrates that we eat. So we swallow the carbohydrates somewhat intact. And when you swallow the food mass, some of the salivary amylase travels along with it, and you would think that the enzyme would keep working to break down the carbohydrate. However, the enzyme is inactivated in the stomach because the environment of the stomach is too acidic. Digestion of the carbohydrate does not resume until the food mass reaches the first part of the small intestine that we call the duodenum. Here the carbohydrate meets pancreatic amylase, which is similar to salivary amylase, and continues the breakdown of the carbohydrate. Any remaining sugars are acted upon by brush border enzymes. Brush border enzymes are special enzymes found on the microvilli of the small intestine that complete digestion. Now, we previously learned that microvilli are tiny hair-like projections that increase surface area of the small intestine and therefore increase nutrient absorption. Because there are so many microvilli, the epithelial cells appear to be fuzzy, like the bristles of a paintbrush, leading some anatomists to refer to them as the brush border, hence the name. Now that all the carbohydrate molecules have been hydrolyzed into their simplest monosaccharide form, they can be absorbed out of the digestive tract and into your bloodstream. The digested sugars pass into the microvilli of the epithelial cells and then enter the capillaries found in the wall of the small intestine. The absorbed substances are now in the bloodstream, and with the exception of a quick detour to the liver, they are ready to be transported to your body cells. Carbohydrates, especially the monosaccharide glucose, provide your body cells with a ready and easy source of energy. When your body cells break down glucose, energy is released in the form of ATP, which your cells use to carry out most of their functions. Of course, if energy is not required, dietary carbohydrates can be processed and stored in the muscle or in fat cells. Those who eat a carbohydrate-rich diet know too well about the conversion of carbohydrates to fat.
Okay, so let's do our own summary of the important stuff that was in there, because that was kind of a lot of information. So first of all, we need to know that monosaccharides don't need to be broken down. They're already ready to be absorbed. But disaccharides and polysaccharides, they need to be broken down first. So they have to be broken into monosaccharides for us to be able to absorb them. And so that's where all of those enzymes come into play. We have the salivary amylase, we have pancreatic amylase. Different enzymes are going to be secreted, and their goal is to break apart these disaccharides and polysaccharides into monosaccharides. So once that breaking apart process has happened, and we're left with only monosaccharides, the first step is that they are going to be absorbed into the bloodstream through the villi in the small intestine. So if you remember those tiny little projections that are in the small intestine to help increase surface area. So this is the villi. The monosaccharides are going to be absorbed through here and into the bloodstream, so right into those blood vessels. And then all of those blood vessels, this picture shows it really well, we've got that web of small blood vessels. They end up joining up and bringing everything to the liver. And the liver is going to filter out toxins, and it's going to help us to figure out how to store different things. But all of that goes right to the liver once it's kind of been absorbed properly through our intestine. And so at this point, there's two things that can happen. If energy is required right away, so if we're exercising, if we're moving around, then it's going to be transported, the monosaccharides are going to be transported to the body cells via the bloodstream so that it can be converted into ATP. So we go through the process of cellular respiration using those monosaccharides to create our energy molecule. If energy is not required, then we're going to convert those monosaccharides back into a polysaccharide, into glycogen, to be stored. Remember, we said earlier that glycogen is the molecule that we use to store our carbohydrates. So we can convert it back into glycogen to store it. And then that way, if we are exercising in the future, then we can break apart those glycogen molecules and use them for energy. So how does our body know which pathway to go on? So if we need to go this way or this way, how do we know what to do? So we're going to look at something here called the glucose feedback loop. And this is how our body knows when to use and when to store glucose. So we're going to break this down. I know this kind of looks like a confusing diagram here, so let's just break it apart. So first of all, let's start here. We always want to be maintaining a certain level of glucose in the blood. And so when we eat something that's especially high in carbohydrates, like pasta or pizza or fruit or different things that include carbohydrates, all of a sudden that's going to raise the glucose level in our bloodstream because we're absorbing those monosaccharides from our food into our bloodstream. So the blood glucose level will raise. When we have high levels of glucose in our blood, it triggers this response from our pancreas to release insulin. And so insulin is a hormone that it basically tells the liver to convert glucose to glycogen to store it. So we're basically removing some of that glucose from the bloodstream. We're going to pack them together into glycogen molecules, and we're going to store that so that helps the blood glucose to return to this normal level that we want to maintain. So that's what's going to happen when we eat carbohydrate-rich food, is we're going to have this conversion from glucose to glycogen to store it, and that's triggered by insulin from the pancreas. Now, the opposite thing, so if we're at that normal glucose level and we start to do something that requires energy, like exercise, we're going to be using up that glucose that's in the bloodstream. It's going to be entering our body cells. We're going to be using it to create ATP, that energy molecule. So we're essentially burning glucose quickly. And so our glucose in our bloodstream is going to drop. It's going to go down. So this triggers something called glucagon to be released by the pancreas. So this is a different hormone that gets released, and that tells the glycogen to be released as glucose from the liver. So all that stored, the stored version of our carbohydrates, glycogen, they're going to break apart into monosaccharide glucose, and then they can be delivered to cells and we can use them. So, and then once we're using up, once we're producing more glucose by breaking apart this glycogen molecule, our blood glucose should return to normal. So we've got two scenarios here, one where we're having more carbohydrates enter our system and one where we're burning our carbohydrates. And our body does this really great job of sensing where our blood glucose levels are and triggering the correct response to be able to maintain a normal glucose level. Now, something to note, and we've probably heard of the relation between insulin and diabetes before, but this is something that is difficult in the bodies of people with diabetes, is that insulin is either not being released enough or it's not able to be used properly by the body. And so you can see that that's a problem, because this feedback loop can't happen the way that it should. So, that's why people with diabetes have to take insulin shots. They have to be very aware of their glucose levels, because we want to be able to maintain that healthy blood glucose level at all times. Okay, and then lastly, where do carbs come from? So there's kind of something called good carbs and bad carbs. And looking at these pictures, you can probably figure out where our good carbs are coming from and where our not so good carbs are coming from. And so this is where a lot of the misconception happens, and people saying like, oh, I need to cut carbs out of my diet. That's not necessarily a good thing to do. We need carbs. Carbs are in fruit, carbs are in grains. We need carbs for our energy. We wouldn't be able to do things without carbs. So, but it depends on where you're getting your carbs from, which is the thing that you can change. So if you're getting your carbs mostly from processed food or products that maybe have these bad carbs, that could be something worth changing in your diet. And so we're going to watch, I think next week, we're going to watch a documentary that it's a really cool Netflix documentary that talks about this idea of bad sugar and how our diets are being taken over by this bad sugar and how we can make changes to try to get our carbs from more healthy sources. So that's it for part 1. Go check out part 2 for the lipids.